My name's Trevor Madsen, and I was 34 when this happened. It was the fall of 2017, late October. I had been working remote tech support out of my apartment in Reno, Nevada, and I needed a serious break from staring at screens all day. I'd been thinking about getting out of town for a while, just camping, nothing fancy, just a quiet weekend away from everything. Somewhere with trees, fresh air, and no phone signal. I settled on an area I'd never been to before, out near the border of northern Nevada and Idaho, about 4 hours northeast of Winnemucca. I'd found it just browsing satellite maps. There were stretches of forest near the base of the Santa Rosa Range, but not part of any national park. It looked remote and perfect. I didn't want crowded campgrounds or well-traveled trails. I wanted quiet, solitude. The plan was simple. Drive out Friday morning, set up camp by afternoon, spend the night and the next day hiking around, and head home Sunday morning. I packed light, just my small tent, sleeping bag, a cooler full of food, a stove, lantern, water, and some basic tools. I also brought my Ruger .22 pistol. Not that I expected to use it, just for peace of mind. I'd been camping alone for years and never once needed it. I hit the road around 7 a.m. Friday. After a long, lonely stretch on a 2-lane road and a few detours down some gravel paths, I found a flat clearing about 100 yards off an old ranch road. The road looked rarely used, just deep tire ruts and patches of scrub. No signs, no fences. The closest building I'd passed was an abandoned barn 10 miles back. I set up my tent near the tree line, not too close to the brush. There was a small creek maybe 20 yards off to the east. No other signs of people, no trash, no footprints, nothing. I liked that, felt undisturbed. The first day was uneventful. I hiked around a bit, found a few animal tracks. Mostly deer, maybe coyote. The air was dry and crisp, and the place was dead quiet. I cooked up some canned chili over the little stove, drank a beer, and listened to the wind rustle through the pine trees. Around sunset, I remember getting a strange feeling, like I was being watched. Nothing loud or obvious, just this slight pressure in the back of my mind. I kept turning around expecting to see someone at the edge of the woods, but there was never anything there. I figured it was just nerves. When you're out in the middle of nowhere by yourself, your brain plays games. That night was colder than I expected. I bundled up in the sleeping bag, pistol tucked next to me under the side of the tent. The stars were bright, the kind of clear sky you never get near towns. The forest felt still, too still. I woke up just after 2 a.m. I checked my watch under the lantern's glow. I thought I heard something. Sticks snapping in the dark, soft footsteps, maybe an animal. I sat up quietly, heart racing, ears straining. Nothing. I unzipped the flap just enough to peek out. The moon was barely giving light. The trees looked like shadows twisting in place. I stayed up another hour, listening. Every now and then, I'd hear something, a thud, a rustle, but it never sounded close enough to bother me. I eventually dozed off, pistol still in my hand. The next morning, I woke to find my cooler moved. It had been on the side of the tent under a tree. Now it was a good 10 feet away, lid open, contents scattered. Nothing was torn apart. It didn't look like a raccoon or bear. It looked like someone had rifled through it. I stood there for a while, trying to make sense of it. There weren't any clear boot prints, just some scuffs in the dirt. Whoever it was had been careful, too careful. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I convinced myself it could have just been a fox or something clever. Maybe even me not closing the lid right. I repacked the cooler and went for a short hike to clear my head. About a mile from the tent, I saw something that made my gut twist. There was a freshly broken tree branch lying across a small game trail. It wasn't cut. It looked snapped. Clean break about shoulder height. That's not something animals do. It looked deliberate, like a marker. I turned back right then, walking faster than I meant to. When I got to the campsite, nothing looked touched. But now I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I couldn't hear or see anything, but that pressure was back, stronger. I packed up what I didn't need and kept the pistol on my belt. I made it through the day without incident. Tried reading, tried making myself relax. Around sunset, I was cooking again when I saw movement behind the trees. Just a quick blur, like someone ducking behind the trunk. I stood up, flashlight in hand, scanning the woods. No one. I circled the tent with the light, then shined it into the trees. I didn't call out. I didn't want to speak. Something about it felt like a game I didn't want to play. I ate quickly, didn't even finish my second beer. I double-checked the tent zippers, left the lantern on, and laid there fully clothed with the pistol ready. I didn't sleep much. Every sound outside made me freeze. There were footsteps that night, not animal ones. Slow, careful. They circled the tent twice. I stayed completely still. The next morning, I stepped out expecting to see more signs, but nothing was disturbed. Not the cooler, not the tent. No footprints, no gear missing. The only thing different was a rock, small, smooth, and round, placed exactly in the middle of where I'd left my folding chair. A rock I hadn't seen before. That was it. I was done. I didn't even eat breakfast. I started throwing everything into the back of my truck. The tent, the cooler, the stove. I didn't bother packing neatly. I just wanted out. As I was loading the last of it, I noticed something else. On the side of the tent, scratched low near the bottom seam, were 3 long marks. Not deep, but deliberate. Not like animal claws, more like someone had used a tool. A nail, maybe. They were perfectly straight. I started the engine and pulled out fast, rattling down the gravel road without looking back. The trees looked different now. Leaning, watching. About 5 miles out, I passed an old rusted wire fence I hadn't noticed on the way in. There was a sign, half-rotted and sun-bleached, nailed to a crooked post. Private property. And oh, trespassers will be shot. I hadn't seen it coming in. It must have been turned the other way, facing traffic from the south. I had come from the north. That entire weekend, I had been camping on someone's land, and whoever they were, they had seen me. I made it home by early afternoon. I didn't unpack for 2 days, just left the gear in the truck, locked in my garage. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those scratch marks on the tent, heard those footsteps in the dirt. A few weeks later, I threw the tent away. I never filed any report. I hadn't seen anyone's face. I hadn't been hurt, but I've never gone back to that part of Nevada. In fact, I haven't camped alone since. Not once. I started using campgrounds again. Places with signs, with people. Maybe that's not the experience some people want. But after what happened out there, I'm not taking chances anymore. Whatever game they were playing, I don't want to be part of it. I was lucky to get out. Some people like their privacy so much, they'll do anything to keep it. Even if it means scaring someone half to death to make a point. And it worked. I got the message. I had been planning a solo camping trip for a while. After working a desk job for nearly 6 years straight with barely any breaks, I finally had a week off. I didn't want to spend it around people, cities, or noise. I wanted trees, fresh air, and to get away from screens, phones, and emails. I picked a place deep in Oregon near the border with Washington. An old forest preserve that used to have a lot more foot traffic back in the 90s but had gone quiet over the years. The map still showed a few trails, and I found an old blog post from 2016 about a route called the Cedar Pass Trail. It had been shut down for erosion, but from what I could gather, it wasn't officially closed. It was just neglected. That was perfect for me. I liked quiet. I packed everything I'd need. A tent, my old Kelty sleeping bag, freeze-dried food, a knife, a hatchet, water filter, and a few other basic things. I brought a small GPS unit too, just in case I needed to retrace my steps. I didn't bring a gun, never really felt the need. I got there on a Wednesday morning in August. It was hot, even in the woods, but the air was cooler under the trees. The drive-in was rough. Some narrow roads, patches of gravel, some potholes, but nothing my Subaru couldn't handle. I parked in a little pull-off area where an old trail sign was almost completely faded. The wooden board read Cedar Pass Trail, but most of the lettering was worn out. I hiked in about 4 miles the first day, following the trail as best I could. It wasn't maintained anymore, so I had to move branches, step over logs, and watch my footing constantly. My boots kicked through dry leaves and small rocks. Everything smelled like pine and damp bark. The trail slowly got thinner the farther I went. Around mile 3, it was basically just a faint line of crushed plants and dirt. By early evening, I found a flat clearing near a dried-up creek bed and set up camp. I didn't see or hear anyone all day. No planes overhead, no cars, just birds, bugs, and wind. That night was peaceful at first. I ate some beef stew from a packet, drank from my filtered Nalgene, and stared at the stars until my neck hurt. I got in the tent, unzipped my sleeping bag, and fell asleep to the chirping of crickets. Then something woke me up around 2 a.m. It wasn't loud. It was more like stillness. The crickets had stopped. That eerie kind of silence that doesn't feel natural. I laid there and listened. Nothing for maybe 2 minutes. Then I heard movement, light crunches, like someone or something stepping slowly on dry leaves. It was maybe 30 or 40 feet away. I didn't move. I tried to control my breathing. My first thought was deer, maybe an elk. But then it stopped walking. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I didn't hear anything else that night. I eventually dozed off again. The next morning, I figured it was probably an animal and tried not to let it get to me. I packed up, moved farther up the trail, and hiked maybe another 3 miles. The trail kept disappearing more and more. Sometimes I had to just guess where it continued. I used the sun and the GPS to try and stick close to the route I saw on my old downloaded map. I passed what looked like a collapsed shelter or fire watch station at one point. Just rotted planks and a rusted piece of tin roofing left. It made a good spot to rest. I dropped my pack, took off my boots, and let my feet breathe. It was around noon. As I sat there, chewing on some jerky, I felt watched. Not in a paranoid way, but like I wasn't as alone as I thought. I stood up, scanned the woods. Nothing. Still, I packed up quick and kept going. Around 4 p.m., I found a dense spot where the trees opened into a mossy flat area near some large rocks. Looked like a nice camp spot. I dropped my gear again and set up. I tried to enjoy it. Made a little fire using some twigs and a fire starter block, boiled water, and ate a bag of mac and cheese. I even scribbled a little in my notebook about how peaceful it felt. That night, the noises came back. Same time, around 2 a.m. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was coughing. A dry, scratchy cough. Not an animal. It was a person. A few coughs, then nothing. I stayed frozen inside the tent. I didn't have a weapon besides the knife. My flashlight was tucked in my bag, and I didn't dare unzip anything to get it. I didn't know what to do. I just laid there, heart pounding. The coughs never came closer, but they didn't go far either. I barely slept. When the sun rose, I stepped out, knife in hand, and scanned the woods. Nothing, but I found a footprint. A human one. Deep heel, narrow toe. No boot tread, just a flat print. Maybe someone in thin shoes or barefoot. It was fresh. I wanted to leave. I checked the GPS and realized I was almost 10 miles from my car. The trail didn't loop, it was a straight out and back route. I could turn around, but part of me wanted to believe I was just freaking myself out. Maybe someone else was hiking nearby. Maybe they were lost. But the lack of gear prints, no boot treads, no other signs, it didn't add up. I pushed on. The trail almost vanished by noon. I was now bushwhacking through ferns, stepping over rocks, pushing branches aside. My legs were cut up from thorns. I was sweating hard. I barely drank anything to conserve water. That afternoon, I found something I wasn't expecting. A shack. It was about 20 feet wide, made from old, dark wood, with a slanted tin roof covered in moss and pine needles. It had no visible door, just a tarp hanging over one side. It was deep in the woods, nowhere near a road. I froze when I saw it. Something about it felt wrong. I didn't go near it. I turned off the trail, if you could even call it that, and made a big loop around it, keeping at least 100 yards between me and the structure. As I did, I found something else, more footprints. This time more than one set, barefoot, and they crisscrossed a clearing like someone had been pacing. Some looked small, like from a child. Some larger, all barefoot. That's when it clicked. Whoever was out here wasn't camping. I turned around. I didn't care about finishing the trail anymore. I followed my GPS back toward the direction I came from, but it was slow going. I couldn't make it back to the car that day, so I found a flat spot and camped again. This time I didn't eat. I didn't build a fire. I just laid there in my sleeping bag inside the zipped tent with my knife gripped in my hand. That night was worse. I heard voices, not talking, just sounds, humming, whispers, then movement, footsteps, multiple people, circling the tent. They never touched it, never spoke, just paced. It went on for at least an hour, then silence. When the sky turned gray, I got up, packed everything in a frenzy, and started hiking. I made good time, barely stopped. I slipped once and bruised my knee, but I kept moving. Every time I stopped to breathe, I felt like I was being followed. I didn't see anything, but the feeling didn't leave. Around 5 p.m., I finally saw the faded Cedar Pass sign again. My car was just ahead, right where I left it. Nothing looked touched. I threw my gear in the back, got in, locked the doors, and drove without looking back. That was 3 years ago. I still hike sometimes, but only on maintained trails. Crowded ones. I never go alone anymore. I've told a few people what happened, but they all just say maybe it was squatters or some homeless family living off the grid. Maybe that's all it was. But I've seen videos of people who live hidden in woods. People who don't want to be found, who watch hikers, who follow them. That shack wasn't abandoned. The footprints were fresh. The pacing, the coughing, the whispers, they were all real. And they wanted me to know they were there, but they didn't want to be seen. I don't know what they would have done if I stayed longer. I don't think I want to know. All I know is that the forest still swallows things. Trails vanish. People disappear. And if you go deep enough past the safe parts, past the markers and cell signal and noise, someone else is out there, watching, waiting, and they don't want company. I had been camping solo for years. I was never into social stuff. My job back in Flagstaff kept me in front of a screen most of the week, running software updates and troubleshooting routers in empty office buildings. By Friday, I was always drained. There was something about loading up my gear, heading out somewhere with no signal, and setting up camp in the middle of nowhere that helped me feel like a human again. I didn't care if it was a desert, a canyon, or a forest. I just needed space. I just needed silence. I just needed to not be around anyone. That September, I had set my sights on a place I'd only passed through a few times. South central Utah, near a spot called Rabbit Valley. The roads out there are mostly dust and rock, and the land is full of mesas, dry ravines, and brush that looks dead even when it's alive. It's hot during the day and freezing cold at night, and the landscape always made me feel like I was the last person on Earth. The remoteness of it called to me. I left early on a Thursday morning with my gear in the back of my truck: tent, water, freeze-dried food, propane stove, and my .45 just in case I ran into a coyote that got too bold. I also packed a few books and my camera. I didn't bring a phone charger. That was on purpose. My plan was to hike a few miles off a rarely used trail I found on an old hiking forum, set up camp, and stay out there for 4 days. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I never did. The drive took about 7 hours. After the highway, I followed dirt roads that wound between hills and dried creek beds. I passed maybe 2 vehicles the entire time, both old pickups with dust-covered windows and ranch tags. No one waved. That was fine by me. I parked in a flat area behind a rock outcrop that mostly hid the truck from the road. I put on my pack, locked up, and started hiking west through shallow brush. I walked for about 3 hours until I found a spot that sat between 2 ridges. The spot was flat and had a good view of the valley. I could see down into the dips and rises of the land for maybe a mile in every direction. There were no roads, no people, just wind and space. I pitched my tent near a patch of sandstone that had eroded into strange shapes. One looked like a misshapen skull, the other like a horn jutting from the ground. The shapes didn't bother me. I camped near weirder things. I boiled water, ate one of my meals, and read a book until the sun dropped. The moon was thin and the stars were blinding. That first night, I fell asleep without trouble. It was the second night when things started to feel off. That morning, I hiked to a nearby ridge and spent hours photographing desert lizards and formations. I saw scat I couldn't place, bigger than a coyote's, smaller than a mountain lion's. I figured maybe it was from a wild dog or something I didn't know. I'd seen bobcats before and even once a black bear near the Mogollon Rim. Nothing ever came close. I had my gun and kept it in the tent at night. Around 2 a.m. that second night, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why at first. The inside of my tent was silent. No wind, no animal sounds. I laid still for a while, listening. Sometimes wind sounds like movement when it hits the right objects. But it was dead quiet. That made my skin crawl. I wasn't used to that kind of silence in the wild. There's always something, an insect, a distant owl, some rustling. But that night, it was like someone had flipped a switch and muted the whole desert. I sat up, unzipped the tent flap a few inches, and peered out with my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, lit up the sandstone horn in the distance, and didn't reveal anything else. I thought maybe I was just on edge. Maybe my body was reacting to something instinctual, something old. I stayed awake for a while, just listening. I thought I heard a crunch of gravel once. Faint, could have been a small animal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. I tried reading for a bit with my headlamp, but couldn't focus. I eventually laid back down and drifted off again before the sun came up. The next morning, I found footprints. Not boot prints, bare feet. They were faint but real. Just a few steps in the dust around 30 feet from my tent. They weren't mine. I'd worn boots the entire time. These were long, thin impressions with deep toes, almost like someone had walked slowly or crouched while moving. The spacing was off too. They looked like they'd moved at odd angles, not in a straight path. I felt sick when I saw them. I tried to explain it away. Maybe they were there before I got there and I just missed them. Maybe some local wandered through barefoot? It made no sense. I hadn't seen a soul for miles, and these prints were crisp, like they'd been made during the night, like someone had come to the camp while I was asleep. I didn't pack up though. That was the worst part. Something in me thought it'd look pathetic to run. I'd always believed fear was something you pushed through, not ran from, so I stayed. That day, I didn't go far from camp. I just cleaned up, reorganized some gear, and hiked a short loop close to the tent. I felt exposed the whole time. I kept looking over my shoulder, stopping at every sound. But nothing happened. By the time the sun started to set, I was exhausted from being on edge all day. I ate cold food and kept my gun beside my sleeping bag that night. I didn't sleep. I kept hearing things just outside the tent. Not walking, not even steps really, just shifts, like weight moving across the ground very slowly. At one point, I swear I heard something exhale. That was when I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the flap slowly, and looked out again. There was a figure. It was maybe 15 feet away, crouched, still. I hit it with the beam of the light. It stood up. It was a man, I think. He was rail thin, covered in dust and dirt. His eyes reflected the light, not like an animal's, just wide and white and unblinking. His skin looked stretched over his frame like it didn't fit right. He wasn't wearing clothes. He didn't move when the light hit him. He just stared. Then, calmly, he stepped backward into the brush and vanished without a sound. I didn't chase. I didn't speak. I just sat in the tent with the gun in my hands until morning came. When light hit the tent, I packed everything in under 20 minutes. I didn't eat. I didn't change clothes. I didn't even take down the tent properly. I shoved it in the pack and got moving. I didn't care about the trail. I moved straight east using the sun to guide me. I didn't stop once. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. Took 5 hours to get back to the truck. I kept thinking I'd see that figure again. I didn't, but I felt him, like I was being followed the entire time. When I got to the truck, I threw the pack in the bed, unlocked the door, and peeled out fast enough to throw dust up into the cab. I didn't breathe right until I hit pavement an hour later. I didn't go home right away. I drove straight to a 24-hour gas station outside Richfield. I sat in the lot for a while, locked the doors, and just stared at the steering wheel. I looked insane. I probably smelled like it too. Eventually I went inside, got a sandwich and a water, and sat in the corner of the store for almost 30 minutes. I couldn't stop shaking. I never filed a report. I never told friends the full story. The few people I did talk to just joked about skinwalkers or desert spirits. But that wasn't it. That wasn't anything mystical. It was a man, a real breathing man, one who'd been out there for God knows how long, living off the grid, hiding in the sandstone and brush, watching people.
Approaching camp.
Moving silently. I looked it up later. There were reports buried in forums and old Reddit threads about a guy seen in that region. Never confirmed. Some said he was ex-military. Others said escaped patient. Others just said, don't camp near Rabbit Valley. It's been 4 years. I haven't camped alone since. I still go out sometimes, but never more than a mile from the trailhead. Never without backup, and never without telling someone exactly where I'm going. I don't believe in skinwalkers. I believe in men, in the ones who don't want to be found, the ones who survive by watching and waiting. And I believe I saw one. Not a monster, not a ghost, just a man who forgot how to be one. I was 32 the year I camped overnight in the graveyard behind the old church on the edge of Union Creek. It was 2017, late October, and the trees had already started to empty themselves onto the cracked back roads. The place was quiet even during the day, tucked between a patch of state forest and the kind of farmlands where tractors moved slower than the clouds. I hadn't meant to end up in that cemetery overnight. I was only supposed to be out for a couple of days, camping solo in a spot I found using a topographic map and some old hiker forums. But like a lot of things in my life that year, it didn't go as planned. I'd been on unpaid leave from work for a couple of months. Burnout, they called it. That was the word HR used. In truth, I just couldn't get out of bed most mornings. I felt like I was always buried under static noise in my head. My girlfriend had left 6 months before, my dad passed away the winter before that, and I felt like my body was still stuck back there somewhere, shoveling snow around his truck to get it started for the last time. The trip was supposed to be a reset. Just me, a tent, some gear, a small cooler, and a forest trail that looped out about 9 miles into the brush before spitting you back out onto Highway 6. I took a Friday off and left early in the morning. I had no cell service before noon that day and didn't miss it at all. By Saturday afternoon, I'd covered almost the entire loop and was looking for a quiet place to pitch my tent before sundown. That's when I came across the church. I don't even know how I missed it the first time I mapped the area. It wasn't on any official route, just this faded logging trail that curved off into the trees. The church looked like something out of a photograph. Weathered white paint, most of it peeled and curling at the edges, a wooden steeple missing its cross, and windows so dusty you couldn't see inside. But behind it, just past a rotting split rail fence, was the cemetery. Maybe 40 or 50 graves, all unevenly spaced, with crooked headstones poking out of the yellow grass like bad teeth. I didn't think twice. It wasn't like I planned to sleep on a grave. The ground was flat, there was no wind coming through that side of the trees, and I was tired. I set up camp near the back fence line, closest to a low grove of birch trees, just far enough that I wasn't directly inside the cemetery but still using its cleared space. It was maybe 30 yards to the nearest headstone. That night started off like any other night in the woods. I cooked some pasta over a portable stove, laid on my back watching the stars blink through the thin branches overhead, and listened to the slow groan of tree limbs creaking in the cold. I fell asleep sometime around 10. I woke up just after 1 in the morning. I remember because my watch face was glowing in the dark next to my sleeping bag, and I reached over to check it after a sound pulled me up fast. Not like thunder or an animal, it was too still for that. It was more like something had brushed against the fabric of the tent. A soft scrape, low and slow, like someone dragging their hand across it gently. I didn't move at first. My heart had already kicked into gear and I was listening hard. There were no voices, no footsteps, no sudden second noise, just that one drag. I reached over quietly and grabbed the flashlight clipped to the inside wall of the tent, thumbed it on under the sleeping bag to cover the beam. I waited maybe a minute, but nothing else happened. I figured it might have been a branch shifting above or some small animal brushing past. Still, I had to check. I unzipped the flap slowly and shined the light outside. The trees looked normal. My pack was still leaned up against the tree where I'd left it. My food bag hung on a line a good 6 feet up, tied between 2 trees to keep it safe from raccoons. The fence was still there, falling over in places. But what got me was the way the grass looked just beyond it. There were marks in the grass, like someone had walked through it, not directly toward me, but from one end of the graveyard to the other. A thin, faint line where the grass had been pressed flat. I scanned the area but saw no one. It was colder than it had been when I went to sleep, a still dead kind of cold. Even though there was no wind, my breath was thick in the air and just hung there like it didn't want to move. I pulled the flap closed, zipped it tight, and sat up listening. My flashlight stayed in my hand the rest of the night. I didn't sleep again. By dawn, the world was back to normal. Blue light poured in through the tent like nothing ever happened. I stepped out to stretch and piss and check the perimeter. The trail in the grass was still there but faded. A few leaves had dropped onto it overnight. There were no boot prints, no clear tracks, just that same soft parting like something heavy had slid through it. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a deer, maybe some sort of night scavenger. I didn't know. I tried to shake it off. I packed up, walked around the back of the church out of curiosity, and found something that set me on edge again. Behind the structure, just along the foundation, was a patch of dirt that had been recently disturbed. It wasn't a full grave. It wasn't even shaped like a rectangle, but it had been dug and then filled in. The soil was darker than the surrounding dirt and still soft underfoot when I stepped on it. There were cigarette butts, too. 3 of them, all fresh, tucked against the edge of the wall, like someone had crouched there overnight. That's when I knew I wasn't alone out there. I didn't wait around. I hiked straight out the way I came in and didn't stop until I hit the side of the road. There were no rangers, no cops. I flagged down a truck that passed after half an hour and got a ride into the next town. I told myself I'd report it, maybe call someone about the disturbed soil, but I didn't. I couldn't explain why. Part of me didn't want to get involved in something I didn't understand. Another part felt like I already knew what had happened. Somebody had been out there doing something they shouldn't have been doing, burying something they didn't want found. A week later, I drove back out. I told myself it was just to get closure. I didn't camp. I didn't even park near the church. I just walked in during daylight with a cheap camera and gloves and checked the graveyard again. The fresh patch of soil was gone. The grass had been reseeded. It looked like nothing had been disturbed. But the fence behind the church was different. 2 new slats had been nailed in place. The nails were clean, unweathered. New wood. Someone had been there. I turned around and left without taking a single picture. Even now, I can't explain what it was that kept me from calling the police. Maybe it was fear that they wouldn't believe me, or worse, that they'd believe me too much and I'd be dragged into something bigger. I know how small towns work. I know how people bury things, and not just in the ground. Secrets, shame, crimes. They all settle somewhere quiet and out of sight. That church and that cemetery were exactly that kind of place. It's been years since that night. I've never been back to Union Creek. I moved states the following summer, got a new job, tried to start over. But I still think about it more than I'd like, especially when it gets cold. What I remember most isn't the fear. It isn't the idea that someone was out there or that something was buried behind that church. It's the silence, that impossible, thick silence between trees, between the graves, between the sound of my breath and the next move I didn't know was coming. That silence is what stayed with me. And when I close my eyes sometimes, I still feel like I'm lying there under the trees, flashlight in hand, waiting for something I can't explain to brush the tent again. But it never does, because I never will go back. I was 32 that summer. I had just taken a break from my job in Pittsburgh and needed some time away from everything. Away from the concrete, the noise, the rush of traffic and people. I wanted something quiet, something slow, something I could control. I'd been hiking for years, mostly around the Appalachians and Allegheny National Forest, but I never spent a full week camping alone. I figured this was the year to do it. The plan was simple. Drive out to a forested area in West Virginia, somewhere near Seneca Creek backcountry. Pick a trail, hike in several miles, and set up camp where I wouldn't see anyone for days. I brought a heavy-duty backpack, a lightweight tent, bear spray, a flare, 2 knives, extra batteries, and more dehydrated food than I could possibly eat. I also brought my 9mm. I had a permit and I wasn't stupid. When you're alone out there, you don't just worry about animals. I parked my truck at a small lot at the trailhead. It wasn't even marked. Just a small gravel clearing with a sign that said, "No maintenance beyond this point." That was fine. I didn't want to be maintained. I just wanted the woods. I left a note in the truck's dash for my brother in case something went wrong, and I started walking. The first 2 days were exactly what I needed. I set up my tent along a ridge about 6 miles in. There was a small stream about 100 yards downhill, and the canopy above was thick enough to keep things cool even in the heat. I cooked simple meals over my little stove, listened to the birds, watched the sun move through the trees. I didn't hear anything man-made. No planes, no engines. Just wind, water, and my own footsteps. It was the first time in years I didn't feel anxious. The third night was when things started feeling strange. It was around 10 p.m. I had just finished boiling water for tea and was writing a little in my journal when I heard something move through the brush behind me. It wasn't big, not like a bear or deer, but it was too consistent to be a raccoon. I turned off my headlamp and waited. The sound stopped. I sat there for a full 5 minutes, hand resting on the handle of my knife, before switching the light back on. I figured it was nothing. A squirrel, maybe. Still, I slept light that night, waking up every hour or so to listen. I kept my gun in my sleeping bag. The next day, I decided to hike further in just to explore. I didn't bring everything, just some water, a first aid kit, a snack bar, and the gun. I marked trees with red tape every few hundred feet so I could find my way back. About 3 hours in, I noticed something odd. A pile of rocks stacked near a tree. It wasn't just a cairn, this was deliberate. 5 smooth stones balanced one on top of the other, with a small piece of cloth wedged beneath the top one. It looked like a part of a t-shirt. I didn't touch it, just took a picture and moved on. But the woods felt different after that. Quieter. The air was still. I saw no birds, no chipmunks, nothing. I felt like I was being watched. I turned back earlier than planned and followed my red tape trail back toward camp. But I made a mistake. I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. The tape vanished. I walked another hour before I admitted it to myself. I was lost. I knew the general direction, but in a place like that, general directions can get you killed. I calmed myself, pulled out my compass, and slowly made my way northwest. Eventually, I found the stream. That was my landmark. I followed it uphill and came back to my site just as the sun was starting to drop. I was relieved but shaken. I cooked fast, ate faster, and got in the tent early. I didn't write that night. At 2:17 a.m., I woke up to the sound of branches snapping nearby. Not just a single step, several, slow and deliberate. I didn't move. My heart was pounding. The tent wall was thin. I could hear everything. Whatever it was, it walked around the tent once. Slow. Then again. I heard something brush against the side near the door. A zipper sound, not mine. A real zipper, not imagination. I laid there, eyes wide, holding the gun to my chest with both hands. I didn't breathe. The footsteps stopped. I waited an hour before peeking out. Nothing.
No steps. No lights.
Just trees and dark. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I walked a wide circle around my site. About 20 feet behind my tent, I found something that stopped me cold. A footprint. A boot print. It wasn't mine. It was bigger, and it was fresh. I packed up everything, fast. I didn't even eat. I just stuffed gear in the bag, zipped up, and started hiking back toward the trailhead. I didn't care if I was cutting the trip short. Something was out there, and it wasn't an animal. I moved fast but quiet, listening for anything. About 2 hours in, I stopped at a rock outcrop to rest and drink water. That's when I noticed something else. Another pile of rocks, just like the first one. Different location. Same setup, 5 stones and a strip of fabric. This one was blue, like denim. I picked up my pack and started moving again. No more stopping. The trail got harder to follow. Branches had been snapped and laid across parts of the path, like someone wanted to lead me off. I didn't take the bait. By late afternoon, I finally saw the gravel lot in the distance. My truck was still there. I didn't cry, but I felt the kind of relief that hits deep in your chest. I loaded up fast and peeled out of there like the place was on fire. Back home, I didn't talk about it. Not for a while. But I checked the photos I took, the rock piles, the area around camp, the footprint. I posted anonymously online, and a few people messaged me saying similar things had happened to them. Same area. One guy said he found animal bones stacked neatly in a square. Another found a shirt tied high up in a tree, like a flag. I went back once more the next year, just to prove I wasn't scared. But I didn't camp overnight. I walked the trail, stayed within sight of the road, and left before dark. I didn't see anything, no rock piles,
No footprints.
but the feeling was still there, like the woods were watching. I don't go back anymore. There was no ghost,
No monster.
just something worse. Someone out there, deep in the woods, doing things quietly, watching, following, maybe waiting for someone to make a mistake and stray too far. I never figured out who or why, and I don't need to. I'm not afraid of the forest. I'm afraid of what hides in it. Not animals, not fairy tales, just men. The kind who don't want to be found. The kind who make sure you never leave if you find them. And I made it out. That's what matters. I got lucky. Someone else might not. I was 32 when I took a solo camping trip in the south of France, near a place called Vilos. It was late summer, early September 2018. The crowds had mostly cleared out, and I liked that. I'd flown from Manchester to Lyon, rented a small hatchback, and spent the next week driving through small towns, hiking during the day, and sleeping in budget hostels or out of my tent. I liked silence. I liked the feeling of being somewhere people don't normally stop. I'd read about a forested area in Lazara, in the Cévennes National Park, with wild trails and hidden glades where you could pitch a tent undisturbed. I drove south on winding roads until they narrowed into gravel. At one point, the GPS gave up. I kept going deeper into the forest until the road ended in a small clearing barely big enough to park. No signs, no other cars. That was a good sign to me. I parked, grabbed my pack, and walked an hour uphill into the woods. The trail was rough and overgrown, not an official hiking path. It didn't matter. I had all my gear, tent, food, knife, bear spray, sleeping bag, water filter. My plan was to find a quiet spot beside a small river I'd seen on the map and stay 2 nights, maybe 3, before moving on. The first day went fine. The sun stayed out and I made good time. I followed the sound of moving water and came to a flat section with a small drop-off down to a slow-flowing stream. There were rocks, shade, and enough space for my tent. I set up camp, hung my food bag from a high tree branch, filled my bottles, and made a fire pit with stones. That night, I cooked pasta on a camp stove and sat by the fire with a small bottle of wine I'd brought. I went to bed early. The only sounds were crickets, water, and wind. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sharp sound. A twig cracking came from the trees downhill near the stream. I lay still. At first, I thought it was a deer or wild boar. This forest had both. I waited. There was nothing else. Just wind again. I must have fallen back asleep quickly because when I opened my eyes again, it was light. The next day, I hiked further uphill without my pack. I brought my knife and a water bottle, followed some animal trails, and took pictures. There was no one.
No footprints.
No wrappers or cigarette butts. Just endless green. On the way back to camp in the late afternoon, I saw something odd. A pile of rocks that hadn't been there before, just 10 meters off from where I'd left the trail. 5 medium-sized rocks stacked in a little tower. Not natural, not old. I touched one. Still had dirt on it. I didn't think much of it. Maybe someone had passed through. I left it alone. That night, the sky turned gray. I built a small fire again, but kept it brief since the air felt dry and I didn't want to risk a forest fire.
He sat quietly, listening.
I don't know why, but I couldn't stop thinking about the rocks. I went to bed early again, around 9. Sometime after midnight, I woke up again. No sound this time, just an odd feeling, like something had changed. I unzipped the tent flap slightly and peeked out. Nothing but darkness. I stayed like that for maybe 10 minutes before lying back down. But I didn't fall asleep. I kept listening. I thought I heard footsteps at one point far off, but I wasn't sure. Eventually, I dozed. In the morning, I stepped out and saw something that made my stomach drop. Next to my fire pit, no more than a meter from my tent, was a second pile of rocks, identical to the one I'd seen near the trail. 5 rocks stacked carefully. No wind or animal could have done that. My first thought was, someone's messing with me, but I hadn't seen a soul in 2 days. No voices, no footsteps, no fires in the distance. Nothing. I checked my food bag, it was untouched. Nothing else in camp was disturbed. Just the rocks. I kicked them over. I packed my day bag and decided to hike down to the car to reset. Maybe sleep in it that night and come back the next day for the rest of my gear. The walk back took longer because I was constantly checking behind me. I didn't feel watched exactly, but I felt wrong. Every snapped branch made me freeze. By the time I got to the car, the sky had turned overcast. I climbed in, locked the doors, and sat there for a long time. I ended up driving 20 kilometers to a small town, Shamboragod, and found a cheap bed and breakfast. I didn't sleep well. At breakfast, I told myself I was being stupid, probably a random hiker or kid playing a prank. Maybe I'd set up camp near someone's usual path and didn't know it. I felt embarrassed. I didn't want to leave all my gear behind, so after lunch I drove back. When I reached the end of the gravel road, I noticed something strange. A single boot print in the mud near where I'd parked before. It wasn't mine. It was big, wide, and deep. Someone heavier than me. I looked around. No tire tracks, no other cars. I hesitated but put on my pack and walked back up the trail. When I got close to the stream, I froze. My tent was still there, so was the fire pit. But something was off. My backpack, the one I'd left zipped in the tent, was now hanging from the same branch I'd used for my food bag. The food bag was gone. I walked slowly into camp, heart pounding. I checked the tent. The zipper had been left half open. Inside, my sleeping bag was torn down the middle, not ripped by claws, cut clean through. A single knife slice, neat and deliberate. My cooking gear was still there, untouched. My notebook was missing. I didn't know what to do. I was too far to call for help. No phone signal, no one around. I packed everything up in a rush and started heading down the trail. I kept my knife out the whole way. Just before the parking spot came into view, I heard a cough. A dry, forced cough from somewhere behind the trees to my left. I froze. It wasn't close, but it was close enough. I didn't run. I walked fast, trying not to look over my shoulder. I got to the car, dumped my gear into the trunk, and locked myself inside. I started the engine and backed up, then turned around and sped off down the gravel road. That night I stayed in a bigger town, Alish. I booked a hotel room and slept with a chair pushed against the door. The next morning, I drove to Lyon and returned the car early. I caught a train to Paris, then a flight home. I never told anyone the full story, just said the trip was cut short. I couldn't explain any of it in a way that didn't sound paranoid, but I kept thinking about that cough. It wasn't an accident. It was meant for me to hear. Months later, back in Manchester, I was sorting through camping gear and found my missing notebook in the bottom of my pack. But something had changed. A page near the back had been torn out. In its place was a folded piece of paper I'd never seen before. Inside, in careful handwriting, was a list of dates and first names. None of them were mine, but the last entry, dated 2 days after I left the forest, had a question mark next to it. I burned the paper in my sink. I threw the notebook out. I haven't gone camping since. I had always liked being outdoors. After living in Des Moines for almost a decade, I found myself more and more drawn to the quiet that came from places far from the city lights, the honking, the routine stress. There was something about packing up gear, putting it in the back of my truck, and just driving out to some forgotten patch of woods. I didn't need to go far. Just a couple hours was usually enough to feel like I'd escaped. That October, I had a few days off work. I didn't really have a plan. I just wanted to be alone for a while, cook over a small fire, maybe do some reading, sleep in my tent under the rain if it came. The forecast said showers were likely. That didn't bother me. In fact, I kind of looked forward to it. Rain meant fewer people around. I had a spot I'd found a few years back. It wasn't an official campsite. It wasn't even marked on most maps. Just a clearing tucked into a dense patch of woods near Lake Wthbun, out in Appanoose County. There was a narrow gravel road that led most of the way in. After that, you had to hike the rest, maybe half a mile. Nothing extreme, but the remoteness kept most people away. I loaded the truck early that morning. Tent, sleeping bag, propane stove, food, water, my old cooler, axe, flashlight, knife, extra clothes, and a tarp. I also brought my small field journal and a couple of paperbacks. No cell reception out there, and that was exactly how I liked it. I locked my apartment door, left a note for my neighbor just in case, and hit the road. By the time I got near the lake, clouds had already started moving in. It was that slow, creeping gray that makes everything feel muted. The trees had already started turning. Oranges and deep reds, some still green but fading fast. I parked my truck by the gravel pull-off and grabbed my pack. The rest I left locked in the bed, covered by the tarp. The walk to the clearing was quiet, damp already, the air thick with that smell of wet leaves and soil. I didn't see another soul. I kept my head down mostly, just focusing on the trail. I knew the area well. Every twist of the path, the way it opened suddenly after a bend into the clearing. It still took me off guard sometimes. Just that sudden space after being closed in by woods. I set up camp like I always did. Tent near the middle of the clearing, under a couple of larger oaks. The tarp got strung low between two trunks nearby in case I needed to cook in the rain. I stacked up a few rocks for a fire ring and collected some wood from around the area, though most of it was damp. I had fire starter logs and a small hatchet. It was enough. I settled in. The rain came lightly that evening, a soft patter that didn't do much at first, just enough to make the ground slick and push that wet earth smell even stronger. I sat under the tarp with a book, wrapped in my jacket, sipping from a bottle of warm water. Occasionally, I'd look out across the clearing. There was nothing to see, just trees and more trees behind them. That night, I cooked a simple meal, canned chili heated on the little stove, crackers and an apple. It was basic but satisfying. The light from my lantern cast a soft yellow over the tent and my gear. I cleaned up, packed trash into a bag, and set it away from the tent like I always did. No bears in that area, but raccoons were common. I crawled into my sleeping bag early. The tent flapped gently in the breeze, and the rain came down a bit harder. I read a few more pages by headlamp, then turned it off and lay there, listening. The woods are different at night. The way sounds carry, the creaks and cracks, the occasional drip landing near your head. Most of it I was used to. I've camped enough to know what's normal. That first night passed without much event. I must have drifted off before midnight and woke again just before dawn. The sky pale and heavy. It rained all morning. I stayed under the tarp for most of it, watching drops gather on the edge and fall in uneven rhythms. I made oatmeal and coffee, stretched my legs, read a bit more, wrote a little in my journal. I thought about maybe packing up and heading somewhere else, but something about the constant rain made me want to stay put. That afternoon, I went for a walk beyond the clearing, down toward a spot I'd explored before. There was an old hunting blind half collapsed near a dry creek bed. I checked it again out of habit, nothing new, just the same soggy wood and fallen branches. The ground was soft, sucked at my boots. I noticed something strange when I circled back to camp. a second trail of footprints near mine. At first, I thought maybe they were mine from earlier, but they didn't line up. The stride was different, a little longer. I bent down to look closer. The tread didn't match my boots. These were narrower. Hiking shoes, maybe. Not fresh enough to be from just now, but not that old either. Maybe from the day before? That didn't make sense. I hadn't seen or heard anyone since arriving. No other cars near the road. No voices in the distance. Nothing. I chalked it up to an old set of tracks that had survived the rain, maybe made deeper in the mud because of how wet it was. Still, I paid attention after that. I didn't feel scared, just aware, like my brain had turned up the sensitivity on everything around me. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf felt closer than usual. I kept the fire going that night under the tarp. The wind had picked up, kept pushing smoke sideways into my face. The rain was steady again, not heavy, just persistent. My tent stayed dry, but the clearing felt closed in somehow, like the trees were pressing in tighter. That night, I struggled to fall asleep. I tossed a lot, listened too much. I kept thinking about those tracks, the fact that I hadn't heard anything. The forest was too quiet. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard something that made me freeze. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate. It was a click. The distinct metal-on-metal sound of something like a latch or clasp. Soft but clear. I didn't move. I lay in my sleeping bag with my ears wide open. My heart was suddenly hammering. There was another sound. A faint shift like weight on wet ground. Then silence again. I reached slowly for my flashlight. I didn't turn it on. I just held it. I don't know how long I lay there. Maybe 10 minutes. Maybe an hour. I didn't dare unzip the tent. I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I must have drifted off again from exhaustion. When I woke up, it was light out. Cloudy, still raining lightly. Everything was damp, soaked. I stepped out of the tent and walked around camp. Nothing looked out of place at first. Then I noticed the tarp. One of the ropes had come loose. Not frayed, not broken, just untied. And not just slipped off. The knot had been undone. I hadn't touched it. I was sure of that. I always double-looped my knots. They don't come undone unless someone unties them. Now I was unsettled. Deeply. I checked all my gear. Nothing missing. Nothing obviously disturbed. My pack was zipped. The food was in its container. The trash bag still hung on a branch a few yards away. But the tracks were back. This time they were fresh, clear in the wet dirt near the edge of the clearing. And this time they circled the tent. Once, around, then back out the way they came. I didn't hesitate.
I paket fast.
Rolled up the sleeping bag, stuffed the tent, didn't care if it was wet, tossed everything in the pack. Didn't bother cleaning the dishes. I got everything ready in less than 15 minutes. I didn't even eat. I just started walking back to the truck. Halfway there, I heard something again. Behind me, a single crack, like a branch breaking underfoot. I didn't turn around. I picked up speed. My pack bounced on my back. I reached the truck and unlocked the door with shaking hands. I threw the pack in and got in fast, locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, breathing. Then I started the engine. As I pulled out onto the gravel road, I looked in the rear view. There was a shape at the edge of the woods, just barely visible through the trees. Tall, still, facing the road. I didn't stop. I didn't go back to that spot again. Not that year. Not ever. When I got home, I told myself I imagined most of it. That the rain, the isolation, maybe the cold had made me overreact. That the shape I saw was probably a tree stump or a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. Someone had been out there, not passing through, not lost. They had come through the woods at night, walked around my tent, unfastened my tarp, and left no sign they were ever there except the things I noticed. Deliberate, careful, not to hurt me, not yet, just to watch. And that thought is what kept me up for weeks after. That someone was out in those woods during the rain, in the dark, just a few feet from me, and they wanted me to know it. I was 34 the summer I decided to camp overnight in an old graveyard just outside of Marlo, a quiet town in eastern Nebraska. It wasn't something I planned far ahead. It just came to me while driving back from a solo hiking trip in Montana. I'd taken 2 weeks off work and was slowly making my way back home to Kansas City. I wanted one last strange story to remember before going back to my cubicle. I'd seen a post online a few months back about a guy who camped in weird places, abandoned buildings, rooftops in cities, old fairgrounds. One picture stuck in my head, a tent set up right in the middle of a field of crooked headstones. Something about it was eerie but peaceful. I thought, why not? I had all my gear in the trunk, no one waiting on me at home, and a full tank of gas. I just needed a place off the map. Marlo didn't even show up in my GPS until I zoomed way in. I stopped there around 4 p.m. on a Thursday. The town was small, really small. Maybe 20 houses, a grain elevator, a gas station with one pump, and a diner that looked like it hadn't had a new coat of paint since the 70s. I got a burger and fries to go, ate them in the car, then looked up cemetery on the paper map I kept in the glove box. It wasn't even labeled, but a gray square about 2 miles out of town looked promising. I figured that had to be it. I drove down a gravel road lined with dry corn stalks and a few rotting fence posts. Eventually, I saw a rusted metal gate hanging off one hinge. Behind it, a patch of flat land with a bunch of weathered stones scattered like broken teeth. I pulled over onto the grass and stepped out. It was hot, dry, and dead quiet.
No birds.
No wind, just the ticking sound of my car engine cooling. I stood at the gate for a while, just looking in. Some stones were tilted so far over they were almost flat on the ground. Others were completely covered in weeds. I saw one tree in the whole place, a cottonwood growing near the back. The fence was mostly gone, just rusted wires and a few leaning posts left standing. I walked in slowly, trying not to step directly on graves, even though most of the markers were unreadable. The ones I could read were old, really old. 1910, 1894, 1871. No new ones. I guess no one had been buried here in at least 70 years. That was perfect. No visitors, no kids messing around, no chance of someone coming by at night. I picked a flat patch near the tree and set up my tent. It was just a small one-person thing, olive green, the kind backpackers use. I kept my sleeping pad and bag inside it, but left the flap open for air. I had enough water, a couple protein bars, and a flashlight with fresh batteries. I left my phone in airplane mode. There wasn't any signal out there anyway. By the time I finished setting everything up, the sun was low and turning orange. The shadows stretched long between the graves. I sat on the ground with my back against the tree and just watched the light fade. I wasn't scared. I was more curious than anything else. Curious what it would feel like to fall asleep surrounded by the dead. As it got darker, I noticed how empty the place felt. Not just quiet, asterisk empty star. I didn't hear crickets or frogs. No far-off engines or barking dogs. Not even the hum of insects. Just the soft rustle of leaves when the wind moved. It was like the air was holding its breath. I got up to stretch and walked a slow circle around the cemetery. I didn't have a headlamp, just my flashlight, and I kept it low to the ground. The beam lit up chunks of broken stone and brittle weeds. One stone near the middle caught my eye. It was newer than the others, probably from the 1950s, and had a chain link border around it. The name was partially chipped away, but I could make out Wilkes. No birth date, just died 1956. That was it. I stood there for a minute just staring at it, wondering who they were and why the grave looked more recent than the rest. The chain was rusted but still intact. Someone must have cared enough to put it there back then. I moved on, not thinking much of it at the time. Back at my tent, I sat for a while and ate one of the bars. The stars came out thick and clear. It was beautiful in a weird kind of way. I didn't even need a lantern. The moon was almost full, and the sky was cloudless. I climbed into my sleeping bag around 10 p.m., left the flap half open for airflow, and lay there listening to the wind. I think I dozed off around 11, but I woke up again just after midnight. I didn't know what woke me. No sound, no light, no dream I could remember, just a sudden feeling of being alert. I sat up inside the tent and listened. Nothing, still dead quiet. I leaned out of the tent and looked around. The graves were bathed in moonlight. The wind had stopped completely. The silence was so thick I could hear my own heartbeat. I waited for a while, then lay back down. I was tired, but something was off. Couldn't shake it. Maybe 15 minutes later, I heard something. It was faint, just a soft crack like a dry stick breaking. I froze. It had come from the far side of the cemetery, near the gate. I held my breath and listened. A few seconds passed. Then another crack. Then a shuffling noise. Slow, uneven, like someone walking through tall grass with a limp. I turned off my flashlight and waited in the dark. My heart was racing. I strained my ears, trying to figure out if it was an animal. But the steps were too slow, deliberate, not skittish like a deer, not heavy like a cow. I heard another step, then another, then nothing. I stayed in my tent for what felt like forever, barely breathing. I didn't move. The flap was still half open, but I couldn't see anything, just the edge of a grave a few feet away. Then I heard something else, a metal clinking sound, like chain on chain, the Wilkes grave. I thought of that chain link border. I knew exactly where it was, maybe 40 feet from my tent, and whatever I was hearing was right next to it. I felt the blood drain from my face. I slowly, carefully zipped the flap shut. It was pointless, really. A tent isn't protection. It's just fabric. But I felt better not being seen. I lay down flat and tried to steady my breathing. I was wide awake. I couldn't tell how long I stayed like that, but the noises stopped after a while. The steps, the metal sound, everything. Silence returned, but I didn't trust it. I didn't sleep. I just waited for the sun. At first light, I unzipped the tent and looked out. Everything looked exactly the same. Peaceful, calm, dry grass, leaning stones, golden sunlight coming through the leaves. I crawled out, stretched, and walked over to the Wilkes grave. The chain had been moved. It wasn't much, but I could tell. One section had been unhooked and was lying on the ground. The grass under it was bent differently than the rest. And near one of the corner posts there was a footprint. A single boot print. Not mine. Too wide. I stood there for a while, heart pounding again. I looked around the cemetery, but saw nothing else out of place. I checked the fence line, walked the perimeter. No cars.
No trash.
No signs anyone had been there, but someone had. Back at my tent, I packed everything fast. I didn't eat, didn't stop, just shoved everything in my duffel and headed straight to the car. I didn't look back until I was on the road again. When I did, I saw something that still gives me chills. There was someone standing at the edge of the cemetery, near the gate. I could barely see them, just a dark figure in the morning sun, too far to make out their face. They weren't moving, just standing there watching. I drove faster. I didn't stop in Marlo. I didn't stop until I hit the next town with a police station. I didn't report it, though. What would I even say? Someone stood near a grave while I was camping? Nothing illegal about that. But I did ask the clerk at the gas station if they knew anything about the cemetery outside Marlo. They shrugged, said it was closed down a long time ago. No one maintained it. Most folks didn't even know it was there. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was a local. Maybe they saw my car and got curious. But I couldn't explain the footprints, or the chain, or why they'd come in the middle of the night, without a light moving slow, dragging their foot. I never went back to get answers. I didn't want them. I kept driving back home to Kansas City. I didn't tell anyone about it for a while, just tried to forget. But sometimes I dream about it, about the slow steps, the silence, the figure by the gate. And every time I do, I wonder what would have happened if I'd left the tent, if I'd shined my flashlight in their direction, if I'd gotten out and said something. But I didn't. I just lay still in the dark, holding my breath, hoping they'd go away. And they did, but not before they saw me. My name is Eric Walters. I'm 34 years old, and this happened back in the late summer of 2021. I live in Pennsylvania, but that year I decided to take a solo camping trip up north, not too far from the edge of the Adirondacks in upstate New York. I had some time off from work, and I needed a break from the noise of the city and the constant pressure of everything in my life. I wanted quiet. I wanted space. I'd gone camping a few times before, but this trip was different. I wasn't looking for a family-friendly campground with bathrooms and showers. I wanted something further out, off the map almost. I'd read about a spot called Timber Hollow in an old hiking forum online. Not many posts mentioned it. Apparently, it was just inside a stretch of thick forest that used to be logging land a few decades ago, but had since been mostly abandoned and reclaimed by nature. There were no marked trails, no campgrounds, and certainly no amenities. It was the kind of place you could only find if you knew where to look, and even then, you had to hike in on your own. The kind of place people passed over because it was too out of the way or not pretty enough for Instagram. That's exactly what I wanted. I drove up in my old Subaru, packed with a decent tent, a sleeping bag, a basic cooking setup, and enough food and water for 4 days. I had my Garmin GPS device with offline maps, a topo map, and a printed guide from the forum that described how to get to Timber Hollow. It wasn't much, just a few notes about a rusted gate, a dry creek bed, and the angle of the old logging road that curved away from a hunting shack. But it was enough. I parked my car on the shoulder of an overgrown service road and hiked in with my gear strapped tight to my back. Took me over 3 hours to get there. The trail wasn't really a trail, it was more of a suggestion made by years of occasional foot traffic. You could barely see it in places, but I followed the instructions, used the landmarks, and eventually made it to the hollow. It was a wide, low-lying stretch of forest with a natural clearing that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Pines and oaks surrounded the space, and there was a flat section perfect for pitching my tent. No signs of litter or fire rings. No other people. No sounds but the wind through the trees. The first night was peaceful. The air smelled like pine needles and damp moss. I set up camp, boiled water for some freeze-dried beef stew, and sat watching the light fade behind the trees. There's something satisfying about cooking over a flame and eating right out of a pouch while the temperature drops and the bugs start to disappear. I turned in early, using a small solar lantern and slipping into my sleeping bag as the night deepened. It was quiet, really quiet. No cars, no planes overhead, no distant music or voices. Just wind and the occasional rustle of a small animal in the brush. But the second night was when things started to feel wrong. The day had gone fine. I'd spent the morning hiking around the hollow, checking out the terrain, and trying to get a sense of how big the area really was. I found what looked like the remains of an old logging bridge over a shallow gully. Just some beams and rotted planks now. There were a few animal tracks in the mud near the edges of the streambed. Mostly deer, maybe a raccoon. Normal stuff. I came back to camp around 4 p.m., made some tea, and sat with my back against a tree reading a paperback I'd brought. The sun had dropped lower when I started to feel like I wasn't alone. I couldn't explain it, just that feeling you get when someone's behind you, even if you don't hear or see anything. First, I ignored it. My rational brain told me it was just the isolation getting to me, but that didn't stop the hairs on my arms from rising. I got up and slowly looked around. Nothing out of the ordinary.
No noises.
No movement, but the feeling didn't go away. I walked the perimeter of my camp, making sure nothing had been disturbed. My food was still sealed in its bear canister, my backpack untouched, and my gear in place. But my gut wouldn't settle. That night, after dinner, I kept my lantern on longer than usual. I didn't want to be in total darkness. I sat outside the tent with my back to a large tree and listened. It was cooler than the night before, and the air had that stillness that makes sound travel farther. Around 11 p.m., I heard something. It wasn't close, at least not at first, but it was movement. Not the small scurry of a squirrel or the padded steps of a deer. This was heavier, more deliberate, something bipedal, something walking through the forest. The rhythm of the steps was wrong for a four-legged animal. Too spaced out. I froze and held my breath, counting the seconds between each step. They were distant, maybe 100 yards off, but coming from the direction of the gully I'd explored earlier. I turned off the lantern, my eyes adjusting to the faint moonlight, and waited. The steps paused for a long moment. Then they started again, a little closer this time. I stayed still, completely silent, straining to hear. Then the steps stopped again. I didn't hear anything for at least 10 minutes. I stayed there until almost 1 a.m., shivering slightly in the cool night air, until I finally crawled into my tent and zipped the flap. I didn't sleep much. Every tiny sound outside made me jerk awake. By morning, I was exhausted. I told myself it was probably a hiker who had gotten lost and was looking for a route back to a trail. Maybe they had seen my lantern and were moving toward it before realizing I was there. That was the most reasonable explanation, and I clung to it. But that gut feeling was still there. The feeling that something was off. I made a decision to pack up camp and leave a day early. I just didn't feel safe anymore. I started breaking everything down after a quick breakfast and loaded up my gear. As I was securing the last of my food into the pack, I noticed something on a nearby tree. It was a mark carved into the bark. A clean line about chest high, running vertical with a second, shorter cut crossing it near the top. Like a crude T. I was absolutely sure it hadn't been there when I set up camp. I would have noticed. I checked a few of the surrounding trees, and 3 more had similar marks, some fresher than others. It was like someone had been quietly moving around my camp during the night, marking the trees. I stopped everything and stood completely still. My breathing was shallow. My ears were ringing from the silence. I scanned the trees, my eyes darting from trunk to trunk, expecting to see movement. Nothing. I didn't even finish my coffee. I slung the pack over my shoulder and started back the way I came. The same trail, the same landmarks, but somehow everything looked different. The air felt thicker. I kept checking behind me, expecting to see someone or something coming up from the hollow. About halfway out, I reached the dry creek bed that marked the turn toward the rusted gate. As I climbed down into it, I spotted something wedged under a bush near the bank. It was a boot, an old, muddy hiking boot with frayed laces and a worn sole. It didn't look like it had been there long. The area around it had fresh prints, some leading toward the hollow and others back out. I didn't stop to investigate. I kept walking, faster this time. I felt eyes on me, even though I never heard another step. I never saw a figure, but I could feel the presence of someone, like a weight on the back of my neck. When I finally reached my car, I didn't stop to change out of my hiking clothes or check my phone. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands were shaking on the wheel. I drove until I hit a small gas station off Route 30 and pulled in to fill up. That's when I finally looked in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes bloodshot. I hadn't realized just how tense I'd been. But more than that, something was bothering me. I opened the trunk to double-check my gear and noticed something small wedged into the mesh of my backpack, near the outer pouch. It was a stick, just a stick, but someone had carved a symbol into it, the same crude T I'd seen on the trees. I threw it into the trash and drove straight home. I never reported what happened. What would I have said? That someone had been following me through the woods, marking trees around my camp and leaving symbols? There was no crime.
No confrontaste.
Just fear. Slow, creeping fear. I haven't gone back to Timber Hollow. I haven't gone camping since. But sometimes, when I'm walking alone through a wooded park or driving past a dense stretch of trees, I still get that feeling. The feeling that someone is watching. That maybe the woods didn't want me there. That maybe, just maybe, I was warned. And I listened. It was late September of 2021 when I decided to take a week off work and head out to the mountains in northern Idaho with my dog, Max. I was 32 at the time, burnt out from my job in construction management, and needed some quiet away from the city noise and stress. I'd been hiking and camping since I was a teenager, and I'd taken Max with me on most of my trips since I got him 4 years ago. He was a German Shepherd mix, loyal and smart, always alert. I trusted him more than I trusted most people. I picked a place I'd never been before, an old forest area near a spot called Quartz Lake. It wasn't a popular site, which was exactly what I wanted. Just dense pine woods, dirt trails, and empty space. I found it through a hiking forum online. Someone had mentioned it in a buried thread and said it was peaceful and overlooked. I loaded my truck with gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, first aid kit, stove, water jugs, and all the usual stuff. I packed enough for 6 nights. I didn't plan on seeing anyone out there, but I brought my Glock 19 anyway. Not because I expected trouble from people, but because animals don't care if you're a good guy or not. I had bear spray too, just in case. The drive took most of the day. I got off the highway and followed a forest road for about 25 miles. It was rough and narrow, full of dips and rocks. I had to slow down to a crawl near the end. The trees were thick and grew right up to the edge of the road, and branches brushed the truck every so often. I passed no other cars. That part didn't bother me. I'd done solo trips plenty of times. I found a clearing about a half-mile from the lake. The spot was flat and dry, with enough space for the tent and a small fire. There were signs that someone had camped there before. A blackened fire ring made of stones and a few old beer cans half buried in pine needles. But it looked like no one had been here in years. I set up camp by late afternoon. Max was already roaming the edges of the clearing, nose to the ground, tail up. The air smelled like pine sap and dirt, and it was quiet except for the occasional rustle of wind in the branches. That first night was calm. The stars came out bright, and I cooked some beans and rice over the stove while Max gnawed on a chew bone. I didn't bother with a fire. I wasn't cold, and I didn't want to draw attention. I sat by the tent in my camp chair, listening to the silence. Max lay beside me, ears up, eyes flicking toward the trees now and then. At one point, I heard something move deeper in the woods, just a branch cracking, maybe 30 or 40 yards off. Max sat up right away and looked in that direction. His ears pointed forward. I stood and scanned with my flashlight. Nothing. No eye shine. No movement. Nothing unusual. Probably just a deer. I went to bed around 10. The ground was cold and hard, even with the pad under my sleeping bag. Max curled up near my feet inside the tent. I didn't sleep great, but that's normal the first night out. The next morning, I woke up to Max whining. It was still dark. I checked my watch, 5:12 a.m. I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The air was freezing. Max darted outside ahead of me and started sniffing the ground with his tail stiff. There were tracks near the edge of the clearing. Not human and not a deer either. Big, wide prints with claws. Bear, I guessed, but they were old. The edges had crumbled. Still, Max was on edge for the rest of the morning. He kept checking the trees and growled low once or twice at nothing I could see. That afternoon, I took a hike with him down to the lake. It was only a half mile, and the trail followed a stream. The lake was beautiful, clear, still, ringed with pine trees all around. No one else was there. I sat on a rock and watched the water while Max drank from the edge. We stayed for a couple of hours, and then I headed back before it got dark. When I returned, I noticed something was off. The folding shovel I kept near the fire ring was missing. I looked all over the clearing for it. I was sure I hadn't moved it. It wasn't a big deal, just a $15 tool, but it was strange. I figured maybe I'd left it out and an animal had dragged it off. I looked for marks or tracks and found a few small ones. Raccoon maybe, or some other small animal. But it was odd that they would take the shovel and nothing else. That night, I made a fire just to feel more comfortable. Max stayed closer to me than usual. He kept staring into the woods. I didn't see or hear anything, but he was restless. I turned in early again. I kept the Glock inside the tent, safety on but within arm's reach. At around 1:30 a.m., I woke up. Max was growling, not loud, but deep in his throat. I sat up, heart pounding. I could hear something moving outside the tent. Slow, deliberate steps. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Max barked once, sharp and loud. I grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent partway. I shined the beam through the mesh. Nothing. Then the noise stopped. Just dead silence. Max was stiff, hackles up, staring at the flap. I stayed frozen like that for a few minutes, listening, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I calmed Max down and lay back down, but I didn't sleep much. Every little noise outside made my pulse jump. In the morning, I checked the clearing again. No prints, no broken branches, no sign of anything. The forest can play tricks on your ears at night. Maybe it was just a deer again or a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been standing just outside my tent, watching. On the third day, I decided to hike further out, to a ridge a couple miles north. Max was calmer once we were away from camp. We hiked for a few hours, following game trails and dry creek beds. We didn't see any animals, but I did find a set of boot prints at one point in a muddy patch under some trees. They weren't mine. I stopped and stared at them. Just two prints, side by side, heading off into thicker brush. No tread pattern, just flat-soled, like work boots or older hiking boots. The prints were fresh, maybe a day old. It gave me an uneasy feeling. I looked around and listened. Still nothing. Max was sniffing the ground, but he didn't seem alarmed. I marked the spot in my head and decided to loop back toward camp. That evening, I kept the fire going later. Max sat closer than ever, barely eating. When I got into the tent, I left the rainfly pulled halfway back so I could see the sky and scan the trees. I don't know what time it was, but I woke up to footsteps again. Slow. Crunch. Stop. Crunch. Max lunged toward the door and barked loud and wild this time. I grabbed the flashlight and the gun and unzipped the flap just enough to look out. I swept the light through the trees. Nothing. Then I caught a flash movement, just past the reach of the beam. I held my breath and aimed the light again. I saw someone, a man. He was standing behind a tree, just half visible. Thin, wearing a hooded jacket. He ducked behind the trunk when the light hit him. I froze. Max went berserk. I stepped out of the tent, gun in one hand, light in the other. I yelled into the woods. Nothing. No answer. I circled the fire pit and scanned the whole tree line. No one. After 5 minutes of tense silence, I went back into the tent and waited out the night with the Glock in my lap. Max stayed at the flap, ears up, eyes fixed outside. To first light, I packed everything. Fast. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't take down the fire ring. I just rolled the tent, stuffed my gear, and loaded the truck. I kept the Glock in my waistband and Max in the passenger seat. I drove back down the road, faster than I should have, but I didn't care. I checked my mirrors constantly, never saw anyone. I didn't stop until I hit the highway again. Even then, I kept driving for another 2 hours before pulling over to breathe. Looking back, I don't know what that guy wanted. Maybe he was just some hermit or hiker who didn't like me in his woods. Maybe he was watching me the whole time, waiting. I don't know, but I haven't gone back to that part of Idaho since. Max was never the same after that trip. He got more protective, more watchful, even around people he used to know. Me too, I guess. That trip changed something in both of us. It reminded me that the scariest things out in the woods aren't bears or storms. It's people. People who don't want to be found. People who don't care if you're alone, unarmed, or far from help. And the worst part? They don't make noise. They don't need to say a word. They just watch. It was early October 2013. I was 29 years old, living in Salt Lake City, Utah. I worked long weeks in construction and rarely took time off. That fall, I finally took 3 days off after a big project ended, and I decided to go camping by myself. I'd done solo trips before, mostly up near Bear Lake or down in Moab, but this time I wanted something quieter, somewhere a little less busy. I ended up picking a spot out near the Grand Staircase Escalante area, deep in southern Utah. It's rugged, dry country, red rocks, narrow canyons, almost Martian-looking in spots. I had only been there once years earlier with my uncle and remembered it being dead silent at night. That was what I wanted. Silence and to be left alone. I had a brown Tacoma pickup, old but still reliable. I loaded it with the usual gear. Tent, food, cooler, a couple gallons of water, my old bolt-action rifle just in case I needed it. I don't hunt anymore, but I always bring it when I'm in remote places. Not because of animals, because of people. That part of Utah stretches far in all directions. You can go hours without seeing anyone, and there are dozens of narrow dirt roads cutting through scrub and sandstone, places where a truck could vanish into a wash and no one would ever find it. I left early on a Wednesday morning, aiming to be deep into the canyons before dark. I took Highway 12 south, passing through Tropic and Cannonville, then turned off onto a narrow dirt road that led into the National Monument. After an hour on that bumpy road, I reached a small, semi-flattened area tucked beside a wall of tan sandstone. It wasn't an official campground, just a spot I'd marked on a map after doing some research online. From there, I could hike into several nearby slot canyons without seeing another soul. No cell signal, no fences, no RVs. Perfect. I set up camp just as the sun dipped behind the cliffs. It got dark fast, and the air turned cold. I built a small fire, warmed up some canned chili, and sat on my folding chair with a headlamp on, reading an old paperback. The quiet was thick. No cars, no voices, just wind brushing through junipers and dry grass. Occasionally, a rock shifted in the cooling air or a bird fluttered in a bush nearby, but nothing unusual. Sometime around 9:30, I heard what I thought was a coyote howl, far off in the distance. Not strange at all. I've heard plenty, but then I heard a second one much closer. It was sharp and drawn out. Not a dog, but not quite a coyote either. Something about the tone was off. Too long, too deliberate. I listened hard, but it didn't come again. Still, it made the hair on my arms stand up. I didn't sleep well that night. Even inside my tent with the rifle close by, I kept waking up every hour or so. Once, I thought I heard footsteps on gravel, but when I sat up and listened, I heard nothing. I figured it was just my brain playing tricks. That happens in remote places. You're not used to the silence, and your mind fills in the gaps. The next morning, I made coffee and eggs over the fire and tried to shake off the weird feeling. I set out on a hike around 10, heading down into a narrow canyon nearby. The light down there was gold and orange, and the walls were high enough that I didn't see the sky for long stretches. The air felt still and cool, and my boots crunched against sand and pebbles with every step. It was beautiful, empty, quiet, the kind of place that made me feel small in the best way. I hiked about 4 miles down and then looped around back up through a different slot. I returned to camp around 3 p.m., legs tired, sunburned a bit on my neck. My truck was just as I left it, but one thing was different. The cooler had been moved, just a few feet, but I noticed immediately. I had left it next to the fire ring, and now it was leaning against the tent. The lid was still latched shut, but the position was wrong. I checked inside. Everything was there, nothing missing, but someone had definitely been there. There weren't any clear boot prints. The ground was mostly rock and hard-packed sand, but I saw a mark near the tent, a smear of dirt like something had been dragged lightly. No animal would move a heavy cooler like that and then leave the food, and no animal would move it without opening it. I stood there, staring at the mark for a while, listening. It was the middle of the day, bright and open, but I still felt watched. I walked the area around my site for maybe 20 minutes, making wide circles, looking for any sign someone had passed through. Cigarette butts, trash, prints, anything. But I found nothing, just dry brush, flat rock, and the wind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept the rifle out after that, didn't keep it in the case. I leaned it against my chair while I cooked dinner, glancing over my shoulder more often than I usually would. I didn't build a fire that night. I didn't want to draw attention. Instead, I sat in the dark, eating cold beans from the can and sipping warm water. I didn't read. I just listened. At some point, probably close to midnight, I heard footsteps. Not animal ones, human ones, crunching carefully over sand and rock. I was laying in my tent, fully awake, rifle beside me, heart beating fast. The steps were maybe 30 feet from my tent, slow and irregular, like someone walking in circles or checking something out. I held my breath, straining to hear more. Then I heard a low, drawn-out whistle. 2 notes, soft and slow. I sat up, unzipped the tent silently, and peeked out. The moon was out, casting a pale glow over the site. I didn't see anything. No movement. I waited. After a minute, the footsteps faded. Nothing else came. I stayed up till morning. By daylight, I searched again. This time, I found something. A spot behind a boulder, maybe 50 yards from my tent, where someone had clearly stood or squatted. The sand was disturbed, and there was a partial print, barefoot, toes and all. Not huge, but adult-sized. Who the hell hikes barefoot out here? The ground is rough, covered in cactus and sharp rock. I packed up fast. My plan was to stay 2 more nights, but that was out the window. Something wasn't right. I got in my truck and headed back down the dirt road, moving slow over the bumps. After about 2 miles, I noticed something in the rear view. A man, walking in the road, shirtless, dirty, just walking straight down the middle. I stopped the truck, watched him for a second. He wasn't carrying anything, just moving slowly, not waving, not reacting. I didn't get out. I just watched. He never turned or looked toward me, just kept walking. Eventually, I put the truck in gear and pulled away. I didn't look back. I stopped at the first town I hit, Escalante and found a cheap motel. I didn't sleep well even there. I couldn't stop thinking about the print, the moved cooler, the footsteps, the man in the road. Felt like something out of a nightmare, but it was real, all of it. A few days later, I talked to a friend of mine who used to work search and rescue in southern Utah. I told him the story. He got quiet, then said, "Yeah, there's weird stuff out that way. Every now and then, someone goes missing. Most of the time, it's dehydration, falls. But sometimes it's not." He mentioned a rumor, one I had heard before but never paid attention to: skinwalkers. Old Navajo stories about people who can take animal shapes, who live in the deep canyons and shadow places. I don't believe in that stuff. I don't believe in magic or monsters. But the thing is, whether you call it a skinwalker or just a man who's gone feral, living in the rocks, it doesn't matter. There was something out there, someone, watching, and whoever they were, they didn't want me there. I never went back to that part of Utah. I still camp, but I stick to more traveled areas now. I've got a family, a house, a life I'm not willing to risk for solitude anymore. I still think about those nights often, though, about how close someone got to my tent, how they moved my things, watched me sleep. The worst part is not knowing their face. I never saw it, just the barefoot print and a shadow of a man walking alone on a dirt road, miles from anywhere. Not a ghost, not a monster, just a person, and that's what still scares me the most. It was late summer 2018 when I decided to take some time off and travel solo through parts of southern France. I had just turned 29 that May, living in Manchester at the time, working remotely in tech. I'd always preferred cooler, quiet weather, but that year had been particularly stressful. I felt stuck and drained, like I needed to breathe somewhere different for a while. My idea was simple: go alone, unplug, hike a bit, and camp out for a few nights. I wasn't chasing anything special, just peace, space. By early September, I was about 2 weeks into the trip. I'd gone through Bordeaux, stopped off at Toulouse, and then started heading southeast. My plan was to camp a couple of nights in Parc National de Cévennes. I had done my research beforehand, nothing fancy or dangerous. It's not exactly tourist-heavy compared to the Alps or the Riviera. That was the appeal. Old stone villages, forests, quiet trails. On the day, everything went wrong. I'd driven into the mountains near a tiny commune called Wthbun. I left my rental car on a small gravel pull-off near a bend in the road. There wasn't a proper parking lot or any signs, just a narrow side path that led through thick woods. The trees were dense here, mostly chestnut and oak, with moss clinging to the bark, and a smell of damp leaves that reminded me of early autumn back in the UK. I loaded my gear into my pack: tent, stove, water bladder, sleeping bag, a few basics, and set off. It was early afternoon. I planned on hiking maybe 2 hours, nothing too extreme. I had a general sense of where I was going, marked the car's GPS location on my phone, and even carried a printed map just in case. The trail wasn't really marked, but it had signs of being used. A flattened path through low brush, with occasional broken branches that looked stepped on. For the first hour, it felt exactly like I wanted it to. The quiet was almost total. Just birds, my boots on the dirt, and the steady weight of my pack. A light breeze stirred the treetops, but down on the forest floor, it was still. The sunlight came through in patches, dappled and warm on my shoulders. I remember thinking I'd sleep early, get up before sunrise, and maybe hike further into the woods the next day.
No rush.
Eventually, I found a clearing just off the trail. Flat enough, dry, slightly hidden by a ridge to one side. I dropped my pack, pitched the tent, boiled some water for a freeze-dried meal. I'd done this many times before. I wasn't new to camping, I had everything I needed, kept things neat, and left no trace. After dinner, I wandered a bit, took a few pictures of the fading light, then crawled into the tent just as it was getting dark. It must have been just after 10 p.m. when I first heard something. I was half asleep, lying on my side, half in my bag, scrolling through some downloaded articles on my phone. At first I thought it was just a deer or maybe a boar moving through the woods. The sound was faint, branches shifting, something soft brushing leaves. But then it stopped and started again. Closer. I sat up. The tent was zipped shut, the rainfly down, so I couldn't see anything outside. I turned my phone's screen off, listened. Nothing. Then, maybe a minute later, I heard it again. This time it was unmistakable. 2 quick crunches on dried twigs, deliberate steps. Not an animal. I felt the back of my neck tighten. My fingers were frozen on the phone. I waited. Another minute. Still. Then silence. You learn to ignore a lot when you're alone in the woods. Noises carry. Wind, animals, even your own breath can start playing tricks. I told myself it was just something passing through. Maybe a fox or even another hiker trying to find a place to rest. I kept listening, but after a while it was just the usual night sounds again. An owl in the distance, rustling leaves, nothing out of place. I forced myself to lie back down. I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I stepped out early, before the sun had fully risen. The air was cold. I boiled water for coffee and walked a wide circle around my tent, just looking. There weren't any obvious prints or anything strange nearby. If something or someone had been close the night before, they didn't leave a trail. I pushed it out of my mind. After packing up, I decided to hike further east. I'd seen on the map that there was an old stone structure, some kind of abandoned shelter or lookout, about 6 kilometers in. It wasn't marked on most trail maps, but a few hiking forums had mentioned it. I figured I'd check it out, maybe sleep nearby. I had enough supplies for 2 more nights. Took me a little over 2 hours to reach it. The trail narrowed the deeper I went, eventually thinning to little more than patches of flattened grass. When I finally saw the structure, it was almost camouflaged, half covered in ivy, slumped into the hillside. It looked like an old shepherd's hut. 1 door frame, no door, half a roof, stone walls maybe 4 feet high. No one had used it in years. I dropped my gear and looked around. The area felt isolated. Not in a peaceful way this time. It was too quiet. I kept thinking about the noises from the night before. Still, I told myself not to be stupid. I was deep in the woods, but not completely lost. I had GPS. I had a charged power bank. There were people in nearby villages. This wasn't the wild. I camped about 30 meters from the old hut, near a sloped hill that overlooked the forest canopy. That evening, I didn't wander far. I kept everything tight, fire small, gear inside the tent, knife within reach. It was probably nothing, I kept saying, but something was off. Around 9:30 p.m., I saw him. I was sitting near the tent, back against a tree, just watching the sky shift colors. No fire this time, just my headlamp off to preserve night vision. That's when I caught the movement, across the clearing, maybe 15 meters back, near the edge of the woods. At first, I thought it was a tree or trick of light, but it moved again. Person, a man, standing behind a tree, not walking, not saying anything, just standing. I froze. Every part of me wanted to bolt, but I stayed still, watching. He wasn't holding anything. I couldn't make out his face. He wore dark clothes, hunched slightly, like he was trying not to be seen, but not well, just visible enough to be noticed. It was almost like he wanted me to see him. I didn't move. We stayed like that, me sitting against the tree, him half hidden, locked in stillness. I don't know how long it was. A minute, maybe less. And then he was gone, just stepped back into the dark trees. No sound.
No footsteps.
I didn't sleep that night. I packed my gear in silence, left the tent up to avoid noise, and sat with my knife in hand, scanning the trees in every direction. The fear wasn't sharp. It was heavy, numbing, like a weight sitting on my chest. I kept thinking, why was he there? There were no other camps, no signs of hikers, no towns nearby. Why wasn't he moving, watching? At the first light of dawn, I packed everything and left the area fast. I didn't eat, didn't stop, just walked. Backtracked the entire 6 kilometers. My legs were sore, my knees tight, but I kept going. I didn't want to be in that part of the forest anymore. When I reached the car, nothing looked out of place. The gravel lot was just as I'd left it. No signs of anyone else. Still, I locked the doors the moment I got in and didn't stop driving for nearly 2 hours, until I reached a larger village called Florak. I booked a cheap motel room, threw my gear inside, and stood under the hot shower for what felt like an hour. That night, inside the room, I finally allowed myself to breathe, but I couldn't shake the image. His body behind the tree, the stillness, the sense that he wasn't surprised to see me, that he was waiting. I stayed in hotels the rest of the trip. No more camping. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was just some local out for a walk or a traveler who'd gotten lost. But deep down, I didn't believe it. I'd been camping for years. I knew the feel of a place, of people. That wasn't someone passing through. I think he followed me. Even now, back home, sometimes I'll be walking through a park or sitting by the window at night, and I'll feel it again. That weight, that silence, the shape of someone just watching. I know it sounds stupid, maybe even paranoid, but I trust my instincts more now. I don't camp alone anymore. I was 33 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the hills outside Eugene, Oregon. It was late October 2019, and I had some time off from work that I didn't want to waste. Life had been heavy lately. Long hours, a recent breakup, and my mind just felt cluttered. I wasn't looking for anything dramatic. Just a couple nights alone, quiet, away from people, with a tent, a fire, some food, and no phone reception. That was all I wanted. Just space to breathe, to think. I picked a spot I'd seen before on a hike. A little clearing near a stream, surrounded by thick trees, about 3 miles off a logging trail. It wasn't part of any campground, just public land out in the middle of nowhere. The place had a kind of tucked away feeling that I liked. No big signs of human activity. No beer cans, no fire pits. Just woods, water, and silence. Felt private. The forecast said rain starting late Friday night and carrying into Saturday afternoon. That didn't bother me much. I had decent gear and liked the sound of rain on a tent. So that Friday morning, I packed my gear into my Subaru Outback, tent, tarp, sleeping bag, camp stove, water, snacks, rain gear, a book, and hit the road. The drive took about an hour and a half. The last part was up a gravel road full of potholes and branches. It had rained earlier that week, and the road was a mess, but I took it slow. By the time I reached the pull-off near the old logging trail, it was past noon. I parked the car on a little flat section just off the road, locked it, strapped on my pack, and started hiking in. The hike wasn't hard, just muddy. The trail dipped downhill for a bit, curved around a rocky slope, and led into a thicker forest where everything smelled wet and green. It was quiet in that deep way you only get in the woods. Even the birds were scarce. About 40 minutes in, I found the clearing. It was just like I remembered. A small open area maybe 30 feet wide, edged by ferns and mossy trunks. The stream was right there, moving slowly but steady over smooth stones. A few thick trees leaned over it, giving a kind of natural canopy. The sound of water was low and constant, like background noise that settled into your bones. I dropped my pack, stood still for a moment, and just listened. Then I got to work. I laid a tarp down over the flattest part of the ground and set up my tent on top of it, double-checking the seams and stakes because of the incoming weather. I tied another tarp up between a couple of trees as a kind of rain shelter so I could cook and sit without getting soaked. After that, I gathered wood. Most of it was damp, but I found a few dry branches under some pines and made a small pile. I even collected some flat stones and built a little fire ring just in case. By the time everything was set up, it was pushing 5. The sky had already gone dim under the clouds. I boiled water for some freeze-dried beef stew and sat on my folding stool under the tarp, eating slowly. The air had that cool, damp bite that creeps in right before real rain starts. I added an extra layer, then walked around a bit, just stretching my legs and taking in the woods. That's when I realized how far I felt from everything. No houses, no road noise, just forest in every direction. And then it started raining. It was soft at first, like a whisper in the leaves, but then it picked up. Not a full downpour, but steady enough to keep everything slick. I ducked under the tarp and watched the drops fall through gaps in the branches. The firewood I hadn't covered was already damp. I knew I wasn't going to get much flame going that night. I crawled into my tent early. The rain got heavier. I read for a while by headlamp, then turned it off and lay there listening. The sound of rain on the fly was constant, almost rhythmic. It made me drowsy. The woods were dark, so dark it felt like the night had weight. I pulled my sleeping bag up to my chin and drifted off, feeling a little cold, but okay. I woke up sometime later, not to a sound, not to a dream, just awake. The kind of sudden wakefulness that feels like something shook you without touching you. I lay still for a moment, confused. Then I noticed what was different. The rain had stopped, not slowed, stopped, completely, like someone had turned it off. And in that quiet, I could hear everything else. A drip from the tarp, a rustle of branches, my own breathing, then something else. A soft sound, faint, distant, but there. It was footsteps. I knew that sound. You don't grow up hiking and camping without learning the difference between animals and people in the woods. These were slow, careful, deliberate, not the shuffling of a deer, not the pitter of a raccoon. Human. They were coming from the slope just beyond the stream, on the far side of the clearing. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe at first. Just lay there, frozen, trying to make sense of it. Who the hell would be out here at this hour, in the middle of the woods?
No campfire.
No light, no sound. I waited, heart pounding, listening. The steps continued, slow and spaced out, as if whoever it was didn't want to be heard. They paused now and then, and I thought maybe I imagined it, but then they would start again. Closer this time, crossing the stream. I could hear the faint splash of boots in the water. I sat up slowly. I didn't unzip the tent. I just sat there in the dark, trying to stay calm. I reached for the small hatchet I kept by my bag and held it in my lap, gripping the handle tight. My flashlight was within reach, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to draw attention. The steps moved to the edge of the clearing, then stopped. Nothing for maybe 30 seconds, maybe more. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of a boot sliding slightly on wet leaves. Just a tiny noise, but enough to make my stomach tighten. Whoever it was, they were standing right at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. I kept holding the hatchet. My other hand was shaking. I didn't know if I should get out of the tent or stay inside. I didn't know if whoever it was had seen me or was just trying to figure out if someone was there. Then I heard them move again, a single step, then another. But instead of coming into the clearing, they turned and walked along the edge, circling around. I followed the sound with my ears. They made a half loop, then stopped again, this time closer to the side of the tent. Still not a word. Still no light. Still no clear reason why they were even there. Then I heard a sharp metallic sound, like something tapping against metal. A knife? A tool? It wasn't loud, but in the silence it was clear.
Top, top?
I didn't move for what felt like an hour, though it was probably less than 10 minutes. Eventually, the sound faded. The steps moved again, back the way they came, across the stream. Fainter and fainter, until I couldn't hear them anymore. Still, I stayed in that position for the rest of the night. I didn't sleep. I didn't turn on the light. I just sat there, wide awake, hatchet in hand, every muscle tense, waiting for another sound. But none came. When light finally began to filter through the trees, I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped out. The ground was slick with mud. The air was heavy and damp. Mist hung low across the clearing. I walked the perimeter. I checked the stream. I even crossed it to look at the spot where the sounds had come from. And there, in the soft mud along the bank, were footprints. Human. Boots. Not mine. They came from the trees, stopped near the stream, then turned and left the same way. I followed them about 30 yards into the woods before they disappeared into thicker underbrush. I didn't see anyone. I didn't see any gear, just tracks and broken branches. That was enough. I packed up fast. I didn't eat. I didn't boil water. I just shoved everything into my bag, broke down the tent, and hiked out. Every few minutes I looked back, convinced I'd see someone standing there, but I never did. The trail felt longer on the way out. The car was still there, untouched. I tossed my gear into the back, locked the doors, and drove. Fast. I didn't tell anyone about it for a few weeks, not because I didn't believe it happened, but because I couldn't explain it. I still can't. Maybe it was just some lost hiker. Maybe someone living off-grid. Maybe a hunter tracking something. But they didn't have a flashlight. They didn't call out. They didn't make their presence known. They just stood there watching, in the dark, in the rain. After that, I didn't camp alone for a long time. I still go out, but now I go with friends. I stick to campgrounds. I stay closer to roads. I bring bear spray and a whistle. And I always trust my gut. Because whatever was out there that night, whoever it was, they weren't out for a hike. And they weren't just passing through. I was 32 the summer I decided to take a week off from everything and just go into the woods. I'd been working nonstop at a construction firm in Phoenix, Arizona. Hot days, long hours, little sleep. I wasn't in bad shape, but I could feel the stress creeping into my chest like slow poison. So when mid-July rolled around and my boss approved a week off, I packed up my old 2006 Tacoma and headed north toward Flagstaff, away from the crushing heat and into the forests. I'd found this spot years earlier while hiking with a friend. It was about 3 miles off a Forest Service road and another mile past a barbed wire fence into a basin where tall ponderosa pines grew thick and quiet. The air smelled like old bark and warm soil. No cell signal, no sign of people. The kind of place where the only sounds were whined through needles and your own heartbeat. Just how I liked it. I brought enough food for 6 days, a big jug of water, a solar charger for my flashlight, a simple sleeping bag, tarp, and a little folding camp chair. I also had my Ruger 9mm locked in a case in the truck. Something I didn't normally bring, but I figured better safe than sorry since I'd be alone. I parked my truck behind a low ridge, away from the road, covered it with a camo tarp, and carried everything in. Took 2 trips and a lot of sweat, but I made it. I set up camp in the middle of a clearing about 30 yards across, surrounded by trees on all sides. I kept the tarp low between 2 trees, sloped it down at an angle in case of rain, laid the sleeping bag on top of an inflatable pad, set my cooler beside a small ring of rocks I planned to use as a fire pit. I didn't want any big fires, just enough to boil water or maybe roast something. That first day was perfect. Blue sky, breeze just enough to keep the bugs away. I sat and read from an old paperback most of the afternoon. Ate jerky, trail mix, some canned beans heated up. When the sun dipped low, I walked the perimeter of the clearing, noting some game trails and animal tracks. Deer, maybe a fox. I didn't see or hear anyone.
No tire marcs, no footprints.
I was totally alone. That night, I slept hard. The kind of sleep you only get far from lights and noise. The air got cold, but I was used to that. I curled up in the bag and drifted off listening to the wind in the trees. The second day was quiet too. I spent most of it wandering through the woods with a compass, just exploring. I carried a day pack with water, snacks, and my knife. Found a dry creek bed about half a mile west and followed it for an hour. Saw a couple elk tracks, a raccoon trail, and what might have been bear scat. No big deal. Nothing fresh. By the time I got back to camp in the late afternoon, my legs were sore, but I felt alive. I cooked a small dinner and sat on the log I dragged near the fire ring, watching the sky turn orange behind the pines. That night, things started to feel different. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up needing to piss. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the bag slowly, sitting up to listen. That's a habit I've kept since I was a teenager. Always listen before you move around outside your tent at night. First, it was dead quiet. Then I heard something. A branch snapped maybe 30 feet away. Not loud, but sharp. I clicked off my flashlight, held my breath. It might have been a deer, maybe a raccoon. The snapping stopped. I waited.
No breathing, no oves.
No movement in the brush, just silence. I stayed still for maybe 10 minutes, flashlight in hand. Then I slowly stood up, walked about 20 feet from the tarp shelter, and relieved myself, sweeping the light around a bit as I did. The beam caught nothing but trees and old logs. Still, I had that prickly feeling like I was being watched. I chalked it up to nerves and went back to sleep. Day 3 felt normal again. I decided to stay near camp and clean up a bit. Gather firewood, sweep up some leaves and pine needles, organize my stuff. Around midday, I saw something that made me stop. A small pile of pebbles stacked in a cone about a foot high, maybe 100 feet behind my tarp. I didn't remember it being there before. The rocks weren't native to that part of the forest either. Redder, smoother, like they'd come from a riverbed. It wasn't anything dramatic, but it stood out. I didn't touch it, just stared at it a while, then went back to camp. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the weird feeling that someone had been nearby while I was sleeping or out hiking. I told myself maybe it had always been there, or maybe an animal nudged them into that shape somehow. Didn't seem likely, but I didn't want to spiral into paranoia. That night, I loaded my Ruger and set it beside the sleeping bag. I didn't normally sleep with a gun, but the unease was growing. On the 4th day, I woke up to find the small cone of rocks gone. Totally gone. Not knocked over. Gone. No sign of the stones. Like someone had picked them up and carried them away. My heart sank a little when I realized that. I walked out to where they'd been. The ground was scuffed slightly. Light boot prints maybe, but the dirt was dry and hard-packed. I crouched and studied them. Couldn't tell much. They could have been mine. Could have been someone else's. I walked a bigger perimeter that day, 1/4 mile in every direction. No other camps.
No trails, no tire routes.
Nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling someone else had come through. I felt watched. The wind in the trees started to sound like whispers. That night, I barely slept. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like quiet footsteps in the brush. Not heavy, not running, just crunching leaves and the occasional stick pop, maybe 50 feet away. I turned off the flashlight again and just sat there in the dark, heart pounding. The steps would stop, then start again. I had the pistol in my hand by then, my finger resting along the side of the trigger guard. It never came closer. After about 20 minutes, they faded. I stayed awake until sunrise. By the 5th day, I'd made up my mind to pack out early. I didn't like the signs. I trusted my instincts in the woods, and my gut was screaming now. I spent the morning tearing down camp, packed everything up in 2 loads and hiked it back to the truck. The Tacoma was right where I'd left it, still hidden under the tarp. I loaded up quickly and started down the rutted service road. About half a mile from the highway, I saw something that made my skin crawl. A pile of those same reddish river stones stacked carefully on the edge of the road. Taller this time, maybe 2 feet high, balanced neatly, right at the point where my truck tracks rejoined the gravel road. It hadn't been there when I came in. I was sure of that. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I drove straight to a gas station about 30 miles away, where I sat for half an hour inside the convenience store drinking coffee and trying to calm my nerves. I never told anyone about it. Not then. But 3 weeks later, I saw something on the local news that made everything snap into place. They found a body not far from that area, just west of the Forest Service road I'd been on. A hiker who'd gone missing 2 weeks earlier. Middle-aged guy, last seen heading out for a solo camping trip. He'd been stabbed. No gear found near him. No signs of a struggle. The body had been buried under a thin layer of pine needles and leaves. The part that hit me hardest? The sheriff's department shared a few photos they'd found posted anonymously on a forum a few days before the discovery. Creepy photos of campsites taken from a distance, clearly without the camper knowing. In one of them, I swear to God, was my camp, my tarp, my folding chair, my cooler. The angle was from the woods behind me, the direction the rock pile had been. I deleted all my GPS pins and trail notes after that. Haven't been back since. Haven't camped solo in years. Whoever that was out there, he wasn't camping. He was hunting.